Imagine a world without science as we know it, where whispers traveled faster than news and unexplained events sent shivers down spines. From the 5th to the 15th century, the mythical period was a time steeped in mystery and fear. What if the wisdom of age was seen not as a blessing but as a curse? What if the oldest members of society, those who had seen the most sunrises and sunsets, were viewed with suspicion, dread, or even outright terror? Number 1. The whispering of the corpse witch. In the hushed flickering candlelight of a medieval hovel, where shadows danced like mischievous sprites on rough-hewn walls, an old woman's passing was never just a simple end. It was often the beginning of a fresh wave of unease, a new kind of dread that seeped into the very earth. This particular fear revolved around the terrifying notion of the corpse witch, a belief that lingered in the damp, peat-scented air of northern Europe, especially in areas where pagan traditions were slow to yield to Christian dogma. It was said that an old woman, particularly one who had lived a life of perceived ill will, or who had been accused of minor maleficium, might, even after death, retain a sinister connection to the living world. Her spirit, or even her decaying physical form, could continue to exert a malevolent influence, whispering curses from the grave, or drawing life force from the unsuspecting. This was not a simple haunting. This was a specific, tangible threat, a belief that the very corpse, if not handled with precise and ancient rites, could rise again, not as a vampire in the later sense, but as a spectral puppet, animated by dark energy. People feared that the deceased might return to plague their former neighbors, to bring blight upon crops, or to sow discord among families. The wrinkles that had creased an old woman's face in life were thought to be conduits for this residual power, channels through which her malevolence could flow even after her heart had ceased its beat. The gnarled hands that once spun wool or tilled soil were believed capable of grasping at the living from beneath the earth, pulling them into a cold, eternal slumber. One common practice born from this chilling superstition was the necessity of physically restraining the dead. In some isolated villages, accounts from the late 13th century speak of families placing large stones on the chests of deceased elderly women before burial, or even driving stakes through their bodies. This grim ritual was not intended to harm the dead, but to prevent their restless spirits from emerging, to nail them quite literally to their final resting place. Other customs involved burying the old woman face down, so that if she were to awaken, she would only dig deeper into the earth, moving away from the world of the living rather than towards it. These were desperate measures, born of profound terror and a desperate desire for safety, reflecting a pervasive anxiety about the boundaries between life and death, and the power of the old to transgress them. The fear of the corpse witch often intensified if the old woman had died suddenly, or if her death was perceived as unnatural in some way, perhaps after a brief illness that baffled the local herbalist. A sudden demise meant that her spirit might not have had time to properly detach from her body, leaving a residual energy that could be manipulated by darker forces. If the community had harbored resentment or suspicion towards the old woman during her life, her death did little to quell these anxieties. Instead, it often magnified them, transforming suspicion into certainty and dislike into fear. The absence of a formal accepted explanation for her death only fueled the local imagination, painting her as a potential agent of post-mortem mischief. Scholars studying medieval folklore, such as Dr. Alistair compilation Echoes of the Old Ways, documented numerous regional variations of this superstition. In some areas, it was believed that the corpse witch could steal the breath from infants, causing crib death, a tragedy that frequently occurred in the unhygienic conditions of the time, and for which there was no understanding of medical cause. In other tales, the corpse witch would visit the dreams of her family, twisting their thoughts and planting seeds of discord. The fear extended even to the very grave goods. Anything buried with such an old woman, or anything she had touched in her final days, was sometimes considered tainted. families might refuse to inherit her meager possessions, fearing that her spectral influence might cling to them, bringing ill fortune to the new owner. The dread associated with the corpse witch also highlighted the precarious position of old, often isolated women in medieval society. Without a strong male protector or family network, and without the social standing that younger, fertile women might possess, an elderly woman who deviated from the norm, perhaps by being childless, or by possessing unusual knowledge of herbs, or simply by being perturbed as morbid superstitions, her longevity, rather than being seen as a sign of resilience or wisdom, could be interpreted as unnatural, a sign that she had made an unholy pact, and that this pact persisted even beyond the veil of death. The fear was a complex tapestry woven from ignorance, social isolation, and the deep-seated human terror of what lies beyond life's final breath. Even the simplest act of mourning could be fraught with apprehension, as villagers wondered if the old woman's spirit was truly at rest, or merely biding its time, preparing for its next terrifying whisper. The whispers about the corpse witch were not just idle gossip. They were a form of communal fear, a shared anxiety about the unknown and the uncontrollable. Imagine a cold, rainy night in a small, isolated village. A knock at the door, soft at first, then persistent. The family within huddles together, their eyes wide as tales of old Agnes, who died last week, fill their minds. Was it just the wind, or was her spirit now unbound, rattling the latch? The fear was so ingrained that even objects associated with the deceased, like a simple wooden spoon or a worn cloak, might be burned or buried far from the village to prevent any lingering connection. The concept of the corpse witch was a potent symbol of medieval life's fragility, where even death offered no absolute escape from the possibility of harm from the most vulnerable members of society. Number 2. The stealing of the milk and the butter. In the bustling, often unsanitary world of medieval agriculture, the health and productivity of livestock were absolutely vital for survival. A cow that failed to give milk or butter that wouldn't churn could spell disaster for a family, leading to hunger, poverty, and even starvation. When such misfortunes struck, and there was no obvious explanation, no visible disease, in the cow, no spoiled cream, the fingers of suspicion often pointed towards an unseen, malevolent force. More often than not, this force was believed to be wielded by an old woman in the community, particularly one who was viewed with distrust, or who perhaps had a reputation for possessing strange knowledge or an ill temper. This superstition, deeply rooted in the daily struggles of medieval life, was about the stealing of vital essences, the fat from the butter, the milk from the udder, the very richness from the yield of the land. This belief was not just about physical theft. It was about a magical draining, a supernatural siphoning of abundance. It was thought that an old woman, through dark arts or malicious intent, could bewitch a cow, making it dry, or cause the milk to curdle before its time, or prevent the butter from forming properly in the churn. The butter especially held a mystical significance. It was the purest essence of the milk, a transformation of liquid into solid gold, representing prosperity and nourishment. To steal its essence was to steal the very lifeblood of the household. Historical documents from various European regions, including court records from Germany and France in the 15th century, contain accusations where an old woman was brought before local authorities, not for stealing physical goods, but for the inexplicable failure of a neighbor's dairy. The methods attributed to these supposed milk-stealing old women were as varied as they were imaginative. Some believed the old woman could transform into an animal, a cat, a mouse, or even a fly, to sneak into the byre and suckle directly from the cow. Others spoke of magical charms or spells, whispered in the dead of night, that would draw the milk directly from the cow's udder into the old woman's own pail. Even across great distances, there were even tales of special milkworms or butter snakes crafted by these women, magical creatures that would drain the dairy products from their neighbors' farms and carry them back to the witch's home. The signs of such bewitchment were often subtle: a cow that suddenly became sickly, a batch of milk that wouldn't churn into butter no matter how long it was worked, or an unexplained drop in overall yield. The social implications of this superstition were profound. An old woman accused of stealing milk or butter could face ostracism, harassment, and even violent reprisal from a terrified and desperate community. Her garden might be vandalized, her cottage shunned, and her very presence regarded with suspicion. If a cow fell ill or a churn failed, the first thought might not be disease or poor technique, but the old woman down the lane, her eyes perhaps a little too keen, her demeanor a little too reserved. The fear was tangible, and it often led to brutal methods of detection. Some communities would burn bundles of straw near the accused woman's cottage, believing the smoke would reveal her guilt, or force her to confess. Others might employ cunning folk or local wise men to perform counterspells or rituals designed to break the alleged curse and restore the lost yield. The specific targeting of old women in these accusations often stemmed from their perceived marginalization and their connection to traditional, sometimes pagan knowledge. Many elderly women served as local healers, herbalists, or midwives, roles that granted them knowledge of natural processes, but also made them objects of suspicion when things went wrong. Their understanding of herbs and remedies, which could be seen as both a blessing and a threat, fueled the idea that they possessed hidden powers. If their cures failed, or if an illness struck after they had visited it, was easy to jump to conclusions about malicious intent. The very act of caring for a sick person or an ailing animal could inadvertently make them a prime suspect if the situation worsened. The superstition also served as a convenient scapegoat for genuine agricultural failures. Crop blights, animal diseases, and poor harvests were common occurrences in medieval times, often leading to widespread hardship. Without scientific understanding of pathogens or agricultural practices, attributing these misfortunes to a malevolent human agent, an old woman with a grudge, provided a comforting, albeit terrifying, explanation. It allowed communities to project their fears and frustrations onto an identifiable target rather than facing the terrifying randomness of nature. Therefore, the failure of the milk or butter, a seemingly trivial household woe, could ignite a furious cascade of suspicion and accusation, turning an old woman into a terrifying symbol of communal anxieties and the precariousness of medieval life. In the medieval village, every pail of milk and every pat of butter represented tangible survival. The inability to produce them was not merely an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to the family's existence. Picture a farmer's wife, her arms aching from churning butter for hours, only for the cream to remain stubbornly liquid. Her neighbors gather, their faces grim, and soon the whispers begin about old Ilara, who lives by the old mill, her eyes always fixed on their cows. This was not a rare incident. General historical accounts from medieval agricultural life suggest that such fears were widespread, indicating the deep reliance on unpredictable farming and the human tendency for inexplicable misfortunes. Number 3. The binding of the bones. In the medieval worldview, the human body, particularly after death, was thought to retain a certain spiritual resonance, a connection to the soul and its earthly existence. This belief extended to the very bones of the deceased, which were not merely inert calcium, but held remnants of a person's life force and identity. For old people, whose bodies were often gnarled by years of toil, and whose lives spanned generations of local history, their bones were believed to possess a particularly potent quality. This led to the chilling superstition of binding the bones, a practice born from the fear that the skeletal remains of an old person, especially one who had been accused of wickedness, could be used for dark magical purposes, or could themselves become animate with a malevolent will. The fear was not just of an old person's ghost, but of their physical essence being manipulated. It was thought that certain individuals, often other old women or outcasts with reputations for dabbling in forbidden arts, could ritually bind the bones of a deceased elderly person. This binding could be done to curse living individuals, to draw power for nefarious spells, or even to prevent the soul of the deceased from finding peace, effectively trapping it. The long bones, such as femurs and tibias, were considered particularly potent, as they were the strong structural pillars that had supported a lifetime of experience. Skulls, especially those of individuals known for their wisdom or cunning, were also highly prized in these macabre beliefs, thought to hold the lingering echoes of thought and intention. Historical texts from across Europe, particularly accounts from the late 14th and early 15th centuries, discussing local folklore, mention stories of graves being desecrated not for valuables, but for specific bones. Grave robbers in these tales were not after jewels or gold, but the very remains of the recently deceased, often the old and infirm, who had no strong family to protect their resting place. The bones would then be used in grisly rituals, perhaps ground into powders for potions, or arranged in specific patterns to invoke curses. One common belief involved using the finger bones of an old woman to create a hand of glory, a candle holder made from a mummified hand, which was thought to possess the power to unlock any door and to paralyze all who saw it. Such items were said to bring fortune to thieves, but only at a terrible cost to the soul. The superstition of binding the bones also manifested in practices designed to prevent such manipulation. When an old person died, especially if they had been disliked or feared in life, families might take extra precautions during burial. These precautions were not merely out of respect, but out of a desperate need to ensure the body could not be disturbed or its parts removed. Deep graves, heavy stone slabs, and even the strategic placement of sharp objects within the coffin were sometimes employed. These acts were not solely for warding off grave robbers seeking material wealth, but to physically protect the remains from those who sought to use them for dark magic, implying a widespread belief in the power of the dead's physical form. The vulnerability of old people, particularly those without close family ties or economic means, made their remains particularly susceptible to these fears. Their graves might be less diligently guarded, and their reputations, perhaps already tainted by local gossip or old accusations, made them ideal candidates for this macabre use. A lonely old woman who died in squalor might have her bones become the subject of fearful whispers. Her remains thought to be more easily exploited by those seeking dark power. The belief reflected a deep-seated anxiety about the lingering presence of malevolence, and the idea that evil could persist and even be harnessed from the very fabric of a person's physical being long after the breath had left their lungs. This superstition also reveals a fascinating aspect of medieval magical thinking, the idea of sympathetic magic, where a part could stand for the whole, and where an object that had once been connected to a person retained their essence. The bones, as the last enduring part of the body, were therefore seen as powerful conduits. If an old woman was believed to have possessed certain powers in life, it was a terrifyingly logical step within the medieval mindset to believe that those powers could still be accessed or even amplified through her skeletal remains. The fear of binding the bones was a tangible manifestation of the era's deep-seated anxieties about magic, death, and the often unsettling power attributed to those on the fringes of society, particularly the old, who seemed to dwell closest to the veil between worlds. The quiet despair of a family whose crops failed or whose child fell ill could turn into furious accusations, driven by the chilling thought that someone had bound the bones of an old deceased neighbor to curse them. Imagine a gravedigger in the dead of night, his lantern casting eerie shadows over the freshly turned earth of an old woman's grave. He is not just burying her, he is securing her, placing heavy stones over her chest, not just out of custom, but out of genuine dread. This scene, though possibly exaggerated in folklore, speaks to the profound fear that even in death, the power attributed to certain elderly individuals, particularly women, could remain active and dangerous. Records of unusual burial practices from medieval archaeanatal sites, like those documented in Death and Burial in Medieval Europe by scholars such as Dr. Robert Lee, sometimes reveal anomalies that could be interpreted as attempts to prevent post-mortem malevolence. The fear of binding the bones wasn't merely a macabre tale. It shaped the very rituals of death and mourning, ensuring that the deceased, particularly the elderly, remained firmly in their graves. Number 4. The evil eye of the crone. In the tightly knit, often claustrophobic communities of the medieval world, where fortunes could turn on a dime, and tragedy was a constant companion, the concept of the evil eye was a deeply ingrained fear. This ancient belief, known as malaccio in Italy or Ayanhara in other traditions, was not confined to any one region but permeated cultures across Europe. It posited that certain individuals possessed the power to inflict harm, sickness, or misfortune upon others simply through a malevolent gaze. And often, particularly in the later medieval period, the person most frequently accused of wielding this invisible weapon was an old woman. The crone, whose eyes, perhaps clouded by age or made intense by solitude, were thought to hold a terrible, destructive power. The fear stemmed from a lack of understanding of cause and effect. If a child suddenly fell ill, if a cow stopped giving milk, if a loom repeatedly snagged its threads, or if a loaf of bread failed to rise, and there was no apparent reason, the blame could easily fall on an unseen influence. The evil eye offered a convenient explanation, turning random misfortune into the result of someone's ill will. Old women were frequently targeted because their appearance might be seen as unusual. Deep-set eyes, perhaps a squint, or a piercing stare, could be misinterpreted as signs of inner malice. Their age, often accompanied by physical ailments or a stooped posture, might also make them seem less benevolent, more aligned with the dark forces that govern such inexplicable events. The symptoms of being struck by the evil eye were varied and often vague. A sudden headache, a persistent cough, a feeling of unease, a string of bad luck, all could be attributed to the malefic gaze. For infants and young children, who were particularly vulnerable in medieval society due to high mortality rates, the evil eye was a constant terror. A baby who cried incessantly or who sickened without warning might be considered overlooked by someone with an evil eye. Mothers would go to great lengths to protect their children, adorning them with amulets, red ribbons, or even performing rituals to ward off the baleful influence. These protective measures often involved specific herbs, gestures, or whispered prayers, all designed to create a barrier against the invisible, harmful emanations. The old woman, accused of possessing the evil eye, often found herself in a perilous position. She might be shunned by her neighbors, excluded from social gatherings, and treated with an icy politeness that bordered on fear. Her presence at a christening or a wedding could cause unease, as people worried her glance might bring ill fortune to the new union or the innocent child. If a personal tragedy struck a family, they might immediately recall an encounter with the old woman. Perhaps a casual glance, a brief conversation, or even just her passing by their home, and retrospectively interpret it as the moment the curse was cast. The accusation could become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the social isolation and fear surrounding her could indeed lead her to become more resentful or withdrawn, further cementing her reputation. Methods for identifying the evil eye, or for neutralizing its effects, were numerous and often bizarre. Some communities would drop a lump of charcoal into water and watch how it floated or sank, believing the pattern revealed if the evil eye was at work. Others would place an iron object, such as a horseshoe or a knife, under a bed or over a doorway, as iron was thought to repel evil. If an old woman was suspected, people might avoid making eye contact with her or quickly make a specific gesture, such as crossing their fingers or pointing with their thumb, to ward off her glance. The very act of complimenting someone could be dangerous, as excessive praise might inadvertently trigger the evil eye, especially if it came from someone suspected of possessing it. Therefore, people would often add a phrase like, "God bless," after a compliment to deflect any potential negative energy. The fear of the evil eye also intersected with other superstitions about old women, particularly those related to witchcraft. While not every person accused of the evil eye was considered a witch, the ability to inflict harm invisibly through a glance certainly fit within the broader category of maleficium, or harmful magic. An old woman's perceived power, even if unintentional, was seen as a threat to the delicate balance of community life. Her social standing, often marginalized by age and poverty, made her an easy target for communal anxieties. The evil eye was not just a superstition. It was a powerful social control mechanism, regulating interactions and reinforcing the boundaries of acceptable behavior, all while projecting the community's deepest fears onto those who seemed most vulnerable. And most were. Imagine a young mother in a medieval village, her infant suddenly struck by a mysterious wasting illness. Her mind immediately goes to the day before when Maid Martha, known for her piercing gaze and solitary habits, had stopped to admire the baby in its cradle. The fear of the evil eye was so potent that mothers would sometimes adorn their children with protective amulets, like a string of red beads or a tiny horn, as documented in folklore collections from across medieval Europe. This wasn't merely decorative. It was a desperate attempt to create a barrier, a shield against the unseen harmful energies believed to emanate from the eyes of a suspected crone. The old woman's gaze, a simple human action, became a weapon in the medieval mind, capable of bringing down misfortune without a touch or a spoken word. Number 5. The harbinger of ill omens. In a world where knowledge of disease was limited and natural disasters struck with terrifying unpredictability, people looked for signs and portents in everything. A flock of crows, a specific bird call, a strange cloud formation, all could be interpreted as messages from the heavens or the underworld. Among these omens, the presence or actions of an old person, particularly an old woman, often carried a heavy weight of dread, seen as a harbinger of ill fortune, sickness, or even death. This superstition was rooted in the idea that old age itself brought one closer to the veil between life and death, making the elderly conduits for messages from the other side, or unwitting agents of impending doom. This fear was not always about association. An old person, especially one who was frail or suffering from chronic ailments, was a constant reminder of mortality, a living embodiment of the decline that awaited everyone. Their physical proximity to death, their knowledge of countless funerals and losses within the community could make their presence unsettling. If an old woman visited a household and shortly thereafter a child fell ill, or a valuable animal died, it was easy to draw a terrifying connection, even if she had offered nothing but kind words. Her very essence, steeped in the experiences of old age and the proximity to the grave, was thought to subtly infect the environment with bad luck. Folklore from various regions across Europe, including tales from the British Isles and Scandinavia, recounts specific scenarios where an old woman's presence was seen as a dire warning. If an old woman, particularly one with a gaunt appearance or a solitary nature, was seen walking towards a specific house at dawn, it could be interpreted as a sign that someone within that dwelling would soon fall ill. If she passed by a group of children playing, and one of them stumbled or cried, her presence might be blamed for the mishap, even if she had done nothing more than walk by. The quiet presence of an old woman at the periphery of a joyous event, like a wedding or a feast, could cast a shadow over the festivities as guests whispered about her potential to bring misfortune. Certain actions of old women were also considered particularly ominous. If an old woman, especially one known for her eccentricity or reclusiveness, was seen knitting or weaving after dark, some believed she might be knitting the shroud of someone nearby, or weaving a spell that would bring ill luck. If she spoke of death or misfortune, even casually, her words were often taken with a terrifying seriousness believed to have the power to manifest the very doom she described. The very act of an old woman crossing one's path, especially at a crossroads or near a graveyard, could send shivers down a spine, prompting people to turn back or to perform a protective gesture to ward off any potential ill effects. The vulnerability of medieval communities to disease, famine, and war meant that people were constantly seeking explanations for hardship. The old, particularly those who outlived many of their peers, might be seen as possessing a mysterious resilience, but also as carrying the burden of many past sorrows. This made them potent symbols in the collective imagination. Their weathered faces, often marked by the hardships of life, could be perceived as maps of misfortune. Capable of transmitting their ill fate to others, the act of giving a gift to an old person or receiving one from them could be fraught with anxiety, with people sometimes refusing gifts out of fear that they might carry a curse or bad luck. This superstition served as a way for communities to cope with the randomness of suffering by attributing misfortune to an identifiable source, even an unwitting one like an old person. It provided a framework for understanding chaos. It allowed people to feel a sense of control, believing that if they could identify the harbinger, they might also be able to avert the doom. However, it also placed an immense burden on the elderly, particularly old women, who often faced social isolation, suspicion, and even hostility as a result of these fears. Their natural process of aging, their wisdom, and their very existence could inadvertently become a source of communal dread, transforming them from respected elders into figures of silent, unsettling foreboding. A young merchant is about to make a crucial deal when he sees old Agnes, bent and frail, slowly crossing his path. He recoils quickly, making a sign to ward off bad luck, fearing that her presence, her mere existence, could taint his fortune. This instantaneous reaction was not malice, but a deeply ingrained fear of the unknown. As observed by historical chroniclers, anxieties around omens and signs were a constant background. In medieval life, and the elderly, often the most visible symbols of mortality, were frequently cast in the role of unintentional bringers of bad news. Number 6. The consumption of youth and vitality. In a time when life was often short and brutal, the concept of vitality was cherished and feared. Youth meant strength, fertility, and the promise of a future, while old age often meant decline, weakness, and the approaching end. This stark contrast gave rise to one of the most chilling superstitions surrounding old people, particularly old women. The belief that they could, and sometimes did, consume or steal the youth, beauty, and life force from younger individuals. This was not a physical theft, but a magical siphoning, an unseen transfer of vigor, leaving the young person withered, and the old person temporarily rejuvenated. This fear tapped into deep-seated anxieties about aging, mortality, and the desperate desire to cling to life. This superstition was deeply rooted in the observation of physical decay. As people aged, their bodies withered, their energy waned, and their beauty faded. Without a scientific understanding of biological processes, it was easy to imagine that this decline was not a natural progression, but a loss, a substance that could be transferred. If an old woman, perhaps one who had always seemed frail, suddenly appeared to have a burst of energy, or if her complexion seemed a little brighter, while a younger person in the community simultaneously fell ill, became gaunt, or seemed unnaturally drained, a terrifying link was drawn. It was believed that the old woman had somehow absorbed the youth from the younger person, revitalizing herself at their expense. Accounts from various European regions, including particularly fearful tales from Italy and France in the 14th century, described rituals or behaviors attributed to these youth-stealing old women. Some stories spoke of old women who would stealthily touch a young person, believing the contact would draw away their vitality. Others believed that the old woman could drain a person's life force through their breath, their gaze, or even through their dreams. There were even more horrific tales of old women ritually extracting the blood or organs from animals, particularly young ones, believing that consuming these vital essences would extend their own lives. These were not just symbolic acts. They were seen as literal transfers of life force, a desperate attempt to defy the natural order of aging. The fear was particularly acute for children and young women whose youth and beauty were highly valued. A mother might fiercely protect her child from the gaze or touch of an old woman she distrusted, fearing that her infant's burgeoning life force could be stolen. Young women, whose beauty was seen as a marker of their marriageability and fertility, lived with the dread that an envious old woman might rob them of their allure, leaving them pale, sickly, and undesirable. This fear often led to social ostracization of elderly women, particularly those who were solitary or appeared unusually healthy for their age, or conversely, those who were extremely frail and seemed to be wasting away. The superstition also provided a convenient explanation for a myriad of unexplained ailments common in medieval times: chronic fatigue, unexplained weight loss, pallor, or even the general malaise that could accompany various illnesses. If a young person seemed to waste away, it was easier and perhaps more comforting in a terrifying way to blame an external, malevolent force, an old woman consuming their vitality rather than accepting the random, uncontrollable nature of disease. The fear of consumption of youth reinforced the societal anxieties about aging and the perceived dangers of those who lingered past their prime. This belief highlights a dark facet of human nature: the envy of youth and the fear of decline. In a desperate attempt to understand the relentless march of time and the fragility of human life, medieval people projected their deepest fears onto the old woman, already a marginalized figure in many communities, became a terrifying vessel for these anxieties, her very existence seen as a potential drain on the vitality of the community's future. Her longevity was not always celebrated as wisdom or resilience, but sometimes viewed with suspicion, as if she had somehow gained extra years at the expense of others, embodying the chilling idea that life was a finite resource, and some old people were unnaturally good at holding on to it. Consider the village herbalist, a wise but ancient woman. When the miller's daughter, once rosy-cheeked, suddenly becomes frail and sickly, a shadow of suspicion falls upon the herbalist. Did she visit the girl too often? Did she steal her youthful glow for her own prolonged life? These were the terrifying questions whispered behind hands, creating a palpable fear of the elderly, particularly old women who seemed to defy the common lifespan or possessed any unusual knowledge. Medieval ballads and folktales collected in works like The Age of Superstition by early 20th century folklorists often feature such narratives illustrating the pervasive fear that one person's gain in youth meant another's tragic loss. Number 7. The Witch at the Crossroads. The medieval landscape was dotted with significant, often feared places: ancient burial mounds, isolated ruins, and especially crossroads. A crossroads was not just a meeting point of roads. It was a liminal space, a place between worlds, where the rules of everyday life were thought to bend, and where the mundane intersected with the magical. This made them potent sites. Among the most enduring and terrifying superstitions was the belief that old women, particularly those accused or suspected of witchcraft, would gather at crossroads to perform unholy rituals, meet with demonic entities, or cast their most powerful and malevolent spells. The old woman, already a figure of suspicion, was transformed into the witch at the crossroads, a terrifying embodiment of forbidden knowledge and dark power. This superstition stemmed from several interlocking beliefs. Old women, often living on the fringes of society, were perceived as having less to lose, and perhaps more reason to turn to dark arts for perceived power or retribution. Their isolation and lack of strong family ties made them easier targets for accusations. Crossroads, meanwhile, were considered ideal locations for magic, because their ambiguous nature made them suitable for summoning entities or performing acts that required a breach of normal boundaries. They were places where the veil between the natural and supernatural was thought to be thinnest, and where the dead might linger, making them perfect venues for contact with other realms. Historical accounts often derived from witch trial, confessions extracted under duress or torture from the 15th and 16th centuries, frequently mention crossroads as locations for nocturnal gatherings of witches, often led by an elder figure. These narratives, though deeply biased and unreliable, reveal the pervasive belief. It was thought that at these junctions, especially at midnight or during specific phases of the moon, old women would perform rituals to conjure storms, blight crops, or bring illness upon their enemies. They might be seen communing with familiar spirits in animal forms, or even the devil himself, making pacts that granted them their malevolent powers in exchange for their souls. The very dust or dirt from a crossroads, if collected by an old woman, was believed to be imbued with power, capable of being used in curses or charms. The fear extended to anyone who might encounter an old woman at a crossroads, especially at odd hours. Such an encounter was considered extremely unlucky, a sign that one had stumbled upon something unholy. Travelers might perform quick protective gestures, utter prayers, or even turn back rather than proceed, fearing that a glance from the old woman or her very presence might bring a curse upon them. The sight of an old woman, especially one dressed in unusual clothing or carrying a staff near a crossroads at twilight, could send shivers down the spine of any passerby, cementing her image as a potential witch engaged in sinister activities. The role of the old woman in this superstition was significant. She was not just a passive victim of belief. She was seen as an active agent capable of manipulating powerful unseen forces. Her perceived wisdom, often gained through years of life, experience, or knowledge of herbal remedies, was twisted into sinister, forbidden knowledge. Her age, rather than being a sign of reverence, became a marker of her long association with dark forces. Perhaps from a pact made decades earlier, the gnarled fingers that once tended to gardens were now imagined casting curses into the dirt of the crossroads. This superstition served as a potent symbol of societal anxiety about unchecked female power and the breakdown of traditional hierarchies. An old woman without a husband or sons to control her, operating outside the domestic sphere, was seen as particularly dangerous. The crossroads, a place outside the direct control of village or church, perfectly mirrored her perceived independence and transgression of norms. The witch at the crossroads was therefore not just a fearful image. She was a dramatic representation of the dark side of aging, the terrifying potential of the marginalized, and the deep-seated human fear of the supernatural intruding upon the ordinary world. This fear, ingrained in the very landscape, shaped how people interacted with the elderly and how they perceived the mysterious forces at play in their lives. Imagine a farmer returning home late one moonless night, his heart pounding as he sees a shadowy figure, unmistakably an old woman, stooping at the desolate crossroads just outside his village. He grips his crucifix, whispers a prayer, and quickly veers off the path, determined to take the longer way home rather than risk an encounter. This scene, though perhaps from a medieval folk tale, illustrates the deep-seated fear associated with old women at these ominous locations. Historical sources on medieval witchcraft beliefs, such as records of inquisitorial trials from the late 14th century, often detail accusations that included meeting with spirits or even the devil at isolated liminal places like crossroads, further reinforce this